Roy Buchanan never attained any real fame or fortune during his lifetime. These days he's infamous for apparently turning down an offer to join the Rolling Stones and his mysterious death in a Virginia jail cell in 1988, as he is for his music. Yet Buchanan's legacy as a guitarist punches way above that of many of the rock stars who held him in such high regard. Born in Ozark, Arkansas in 1939, Leroy Buch Buchanan was a master of the Telecaster who elevated Leo Fender's humble working man's electric guitar to the level of a Stradivarius violin. It was Buchanan, along with the fellow doom genius Danny Gatton, who seeded the ongoing obsession with Telecaster tone. He pioneered the use of Fender's firstborn six-string volume and tone controls as an onboard effects. Despite the massive developments in guitar technology in the 70s and 80s, Gatton and Buchanan proved that the most versatile solid-body electric guitar ever designed just happened to be the oldest and simplest. Like Gatton, Buchanan was most famously associated with a 1953 Fender Telecaster nicknamed Nancy. This beaten-to-hell survivor has become an iconic as Buchanan himself. To understand Buchanan's impact on the history of the Fender Telecaster, you need to explore the guitar's origins. Leo Fender, a lap steel and amplifier manufacturer based in Fullerton, California, began working on a solid-body electric guitar concept in the late 1940s. Fender essentially took the design of his lap steel and adapted it into a six-string that could be played like a traditional Spanish guitar. Crucially, Fender didn't play guitar himself. He approached the project as a problem solver. Existing guitars had big, hollow bodies. They had a tendency to squeal with the electric feedback when amplified, and their mahogany necks would likely as not snap if the guitar was dropped. Fender introduced a solid body to drastically reduce feedback and introduced a bolt-on neck that could be replaced easily if damaged. Christian the Esquire, the new single pickup guitar, was not your classic overnight success. Introduced at a trade show in 1950, it was savagely ridiculed, with one wag dubbing it a toilet seat with strings. Later that year, two pickup version, the Broadcaster, was launched, and after a challenge from the Gresh Company, who made drums with a similar name, the guitar was renamed Telecaster in 1952. The toilet seat with strings soon began to develop its own vocabulary thanks to players such as country jazz shredder Jimmy Bryant, Ricky Nelson, and Elvis Presley sideman James Burton, and the Bakersfield icon Don Rich of Buck Owens and his Buckaroos. Blues artists including Muddy Waters, Albert Collins, and Buchanan himself soon discovered that the basic little guitar was a tonal chameleon. Many people still don't know that Jimmy Page used a 59 Telecaster on the first Led Zeppelin album and not the Gibson Les Paul they assume they hear. Buchanan fan Jeff Beck pulled squawks, wails, and sitar sounds out of his monumentally pimped 50s Tele with the Yardbirds. For Buchanan's part, he mined the Telecaster's lap guitar heritage, manipulating the instrument's volume and tone controls with his pinky to emulate the sound of wailing country steels. He could simulate a phasing effect, palm muting along the strings, and would flip from aching long sustained bends to breakneck speed blues runs in a split second. The latter is a major element in Joe Bonamassa's style. It's there in Sweet Dreams, from the opening faded-in D, E, and F sharp notes to the nitroed flourish just after the 1-minute mark. And that sound, man, before guys like Buchanan, great guitar tone was really just a happy accident. He taught us to treat it like the Holy Grail. Like his favorite guitar, Buchanan refused to be typecast as a player, splicing threads of rockabilly, country, jazz, and pop DNA into his blues rock delivery. He was a jobbing guitarist his whole life, your classic gun for hire, and guys like him needed the skills to play any style of music in order to survive and keep paying the bills. One element of Buchanan's character that was true to the blues tradition was his tendency to self-mythologize. The oft-repeated story that he turned down an offer to replace the then recently sacked Brian Jones in the Stones in 1969, the job that eventually went to Mick Taylor, has never been established as fact. If he ever wished to be anointed by rock and roll royalty, it went down differently from what he would have liked. When Keith Richards reminisced about Buchanan in a 1998 interview with the Rolling Stones, his comments weren't exactly tinged with fondness. Eric Clapton and Ronnie Wood and I pissed in his beer once. It's the only time we ever got that mean with anybody. It was an Atlantic recording session in the 70s. I said, "Go ahead, Eric, get your cock out. We'll be pissing in that fucker's beer. He's been too pushy." Eric will deny it, of course, but don't worry about it. I've got Ronnie Wood to back me up. It's possible that Buchanan's claim that he said no to Mick and Keith is what pissed off the Stones guitarists, especially if the invitation was never actually extended to him in the first place. Maybe he was considered, but then it's likely that anyone who could play guitar and not take the spotlight off of Mick Jagger was in a shout. That's what I did for Small Faces refugee Steve Marriott. Apparently, how could you have someone with a voice like that and about as laid back as Speedy Gonzales sharing the stage with Jagger? The Stones thing is not the squeaky board in the backstory. Even the tale of how Buchanan came into possession of his Telecaster, Nancy Blanche, is a little under close scrutiny. Apparently, while working a day job as a barber, Buchanan saw someone walk past the shop window carrying the battered old Telecaster under their arm. "I knew that guitar was mine, he said later. I walked out right in the middle of the haircut and I said, "Where'd you get that guitar?" I just told him I want it. I said, "I'll get you the most beautiful guitar you've ever seen and I'll trade you straight across." I left work that day and went to a friend of mine with connections and said, "I want a purple Telecaster." He had it before the sun went down. We swapped guitars, man. That was it. It was like he knew it was my guitar, too. While the yarn is not completely implausible, laying his hands on a purple Telly at the short notice even back in the swinging 60s feels like a bit of a stretch. It made for a good story, however, and Buchanan was only continuing a blues tradition that stretched back to the Mississippi Delta of the late 20s and the early 30s, spooky myths pulled in the punters at your local juke joints. Troubadour Tommy Johnson, who wrote Canned Heat Blues, put the rumor about that he'd sold his soul to Satan in exchange for killer guitar skills, time, midnight, place, and unspecified crossroads. Of course, the origins of the myth became confused over the years, and by the release of Robert Johnson's King of the Delta Blues Singers compilation album in 1961, the pact with Satan story was attributed to Robert Johnson. If Buchanan was telling porkies, he really didn't have to. Like Robert Johnson, it's the jaw-dropping guitar chops that are the real story, even if the rock and roll myth machine likes you to go out with a bang. Roy Buchanan's death is still the subject of fierce debate. Officially ruled as suicide, he was found hanging in a cell at Fairfax Jail in Virginia, his shirt tied around his neck on August 14, 1988. Some claim that bruising around his head proved that he had been assaulted after being arrested for public intoxication following a domestic dispute. We'll likely never know the truth. It was a tragic end for a guitar genius. Yet the circumstances were suitably dark and mysterious for a blues musician. In a further tragic twist, fellow telemaster Danny Gatton committed suicide in October 1994. In the aftermath of Buchanan's death, there was an inevitable increase in interest in his back catalog. Ultimately, Roy Buchanan remains a cult figure, the guitarist's guitarist that not even Martin Scorsese can pull out of the shadows. Danny Gatton eventually grasped the fame that he craved, only for it to fuel a depression that would lead to his suicide. Buchanan, according to an interview he conducted shortly before he departed for the last time, faced no such demons. Probably the reason I never made it big is because I never cared whether I made it big or not. All I wanted to do was learn to play the guitar for myself. You set your own goals for success, and when you succeed, it don't necessarily mean that you will be a big star or make a lot of money or anything. You feel it in your heart whether you've succeeded or not. Buchanan didn't become a big star or make lots of money, and he probably didn't say no to the Stones, but the man who turned guitar tone into an art form attained successfully that one thing every guitarist dreams of, a unique sound that can't be claimed by anybody else, and that's what sweet dreams are made of.